April 17th, 1992, a Friday. The kind of spring morning that carries a strange, restless energy, the clouds heavy, the air damp, and the rivers swollen from 3 days of relentless rain. Mark Dalton, 32 years old, woke before dawn in his small ranch-style home just outside Bridgewater, Oregon. He moved through his usual routine with quiet precision. Coffee poured into a chipped white mug, uniform shirt buttoned to the collar, steel-toed boots laced tight. To his co-workers at Northwest Provisions, Mark was dependable to a fault. A quiet man who rarely missed a day, never made a scene, and always kept his routes on schedule. If anyone had asked, they'd have said he was just like any other delivery driver, but this day would be his last. By 7:45 a.m., Mark rolled out of the company lot, behind the wheel of his white Ford delivery truck, inventory stacked neatly in the back. He'd done this drive hundreds of times before, winding rural highways, narrow bridges, isolated service roads where cell signals dropped to nothing. But today, the world felt different. The rain hadn't let up in days, and the Willamette River had begun spilling over its banks. Roads were slick, shoulders eroded, and water pooled in shallow dips that turned to black mirrors under the gray sky. Despite the storm, Mark followed his route like clockwork. Grocery stores, gas stations, diners scattered across Bridgewater County. He was known for running ahead of schedule, sometimes even helping unload crates when the weather was bad. Locals knew his face, though few knew much about the man himself. Divorced, no kids, a few fishing buddies he saw twice a month if the rain held off. To most, Mark was simply part of the backdrop. The guy who brought the food, exchanged a few polite words, and moved on. By midday, the rain turned from steady drizzle to sheets of water pounding the truck's windshield. The radio warned of rising currents near Devil's Bend Bridge, a 2-lane crossing notorious for accidents. Mark slowed, but didn't stop. There was no reason to think this day would be any different. At 4:23 p.m., Mark made his final confirmed delivery. After that moment, his life, and everything anyone thought they knew about it, vanished into silence. The last person to see Mark Dalton alive was Evelyn Harris, waitress at the Pine Grove Diner, a weather-beaten roadside stop on the edge of Bridgewater County. She remembers the time exactly, 4:23 p.m. Mark pulled up in his white Ford, windshield wipers fighting against heavy rain, his delivery manifest tucked under one arm. He looked tired but cheerful, the same as always. "Afternoon, Ev," he said as he stepped inside, boots squeaking on the linoleum floor. Evelyn swears there was nothing unusual in his demeanor, no sign of fear, no hint of distraction. He chatted briefly about the weather, joked about needing a second boat license to drive these roads, then signed the invoice and left. The delivery was routine: 3 crates of packaged goods, 2 boxes of coffee supplies, 1 frozen meat order. Nothing out of the ordinary. But witnesses remembered details differently. One customer sitting by the window claimed he saw Mark hesitate before climbing back into his truck, standing still for several seconds in the rain, as if deciding whether to leave. Another insists there was a dark blue sedan parked across the highway, engine running, windows fogged from the storm. No one ever identified the car or its driver. By 4:31 p.m., Mark was back on the road. The Pine Grove Diner sits at the crossroads of 2 county routes, one leading back toward the main highway, the other winding deeper into the forest, past Devil's Bend Bridge, and into the lowlands where the Willamette swallows everything in heavy rain. According to his delivery manifest, Mark's next stop should have taken him back toward town. Instead, his truck's last GPS ping places him near the bend just 12 minutes later. At first, police assumed he'd simply missed a turn, but Evelyn recalls watching his taillights fade south, the wrong direction entirely. "I thought maybe he was trying a shortcut," she said years later. "But something about the way he drove off, I don't know. It felt off, like he was rushing to get somewhere." By 5 p.m., Mark failed to check in with dispatch. Calls to his radio went unanswered. At 5:17, his GPS went dark completely. No distress call, no witness reports of an accident. Just silence, swallowed by the storm and the river below Devil's Bend Bridge. That was the last confirmed trace of Mark Dalton. Everything after this moment would become speculation and eventually obsession. By 6 p.m., the depot had started to worry. Mark Dalton was always on time, sometimes early, but never late without calling. His shift supervisor, Ray Kessler, tried his radio first. No response. He tried again. Still, nothing but static. At first, no one panicked. The storm had been pounding Bridgewater County all day. Dead zones were common, especially near the rivers. Mark could have been delayed unloading, pulled over to wait out the worst of the rain, or taking a detour around flooded back roads. But by 6:12 p.m., something strange happened. A final GPS ping from Mark's truck came through. The signal placed him at the southern approach of Devil's Bend Bridge, a 2-lane span over the Willamette River notorious among locals for accidents and urban legends alike. And then, silence. No more pings, no movement. His onboard tracker went completely dead, as if the truck had vanished off the map. Ray tried the radio again. Dispatch called his work phone. Angela, his ex-wife, tried his personal line. No answer on any channel. By 6:45 p.m., clouds rolled lower, lightning splitting the horizon while the river below Devil's Bend churned and frothed like an animal tearing at its restraints. It wasn't uncommon for debris, entire trees sometimes, to get pulled beneath the currents and vanish completely. If a vehicle had gone off the road, it could be gone in seconds. But there were no reports of tire tracks, no scraped guardrails, no shattered reflectors. Nothing. Around 7 p.m., heavy winds toppled branches along County Route 9, blocking lanes and making travel nearly impossible. Deputies radioed in from the field, confirming that visibility had dropped to almost zero. Then came a troubling discovery. Highway cameras leading up to the bridge showed Mark's truck passing the diner at 4:31 p.m., just as Evelyn Harris remembered. But there's no record of the truck crossing back onto the main highway. No exit cameras picked him up. In a span of fewer than 20 minutes, the delivery driver simply vanished into a 5-mile dead zone known for swallowing secrets. By nightfall, the rain kept falling harder, and fear was setting in. Mark Dalton had disappeared, and no one could explain how. At first, the police assumed a breakdown. Mark's truck was older, prone to electrical glitches, and with the storm hitting hard, they figured he'd slid into a ditch or pulled off the road for safety. But when the company confirmed no contact and the GPS remained dead, deputies initiated a Level 2 search protocol. By 9 p.m., flashing lights cut through the rain along the narrow county roads, sirens wailing against the thunder. The search began with obvious routes, Mark's usual delivery path traced mile by mile. Officers scoured shoulders, culverts, and embankments, stopping at nearby homes to ask if anyone had seen a white Ford delivery truck. No one had. By midnight, Mark's family had been contacted. Angela arrived at the depot, pale and shaking, her voice breaking as she kept repeating, "He wouldn't just leave." Mark's younger brother, David Dalton, got there minutes later, immediately joining deputies along the backroads with a flashlight, ignoring orders to stay put. By sunrise, the search had expanded. Over 40 volunteers, co-workers, and residents joined in. Spreading out in teams, helicopters flew grid patterns above Devil's Bend, their spotlights cutting through mist rolling off the river. Dive teams staged near the bridge but were pulled back when currents reached dangerous speeds. And yet, despite hours of searching, they found nothing. No truck, no body, no skid marks or debris. Even the muddy embankments around Devil's Bend were untouched, as if no vehicle had passed at all. By the second day, rumors began circling Bridgewater. Some believed Mark had driven into the river. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities, a hijacking, a robbery gone wrong. A few dredged up old stories about the bend itself, 3 locals dead since 1966, 2 of them never recovered. When Sheriff Paul Lasker addressed reporters on the courthouse steps, his words were careful, deliberate. "At this time, we are treating Mr. Dalton's disappearance as a missing person case. There is no evidence of foul play." Privately, deputies said something different. Cars didn't just vanish. By the end of the 3rd day, they had exhausted every road, every field, every ditch. The only thing the search turned up was questions. Mark Dalton had driven into a storm and simply ceased to exist. By the end of the 1st week, Bridgewater had turned into a town of whispers. Mark Dalton's name was on everyone's lips, yet no one seemed to agree on what happened to him. At the Pine Grove Diner, where he was last seen, regulars swapped theories over steaming cups of black coffee and rain-speckled windows. Some insisted he'd run away, that he'd grown tired of the endless deliveries and lonely nights, and decided to start fresh somewhere else. Others pointed to Mark's divorce 2 years prior, spinning stories about mounting debts and a man desperate to escape his life. But those who knew Mark best, his co-workers and a handful of old fishing buddies, scoffed at the idea. "Mark was steady," one said. "That man lived by routine. He didn't just disappear." Soon, the theories turned darker. By Tuesday, talk of Devil's Bend Bridge began to circulate again, fueled by decades of local legends. Since the 1960s, 3 people had drowned beneath that span, 2 fishermen in '66, a high schooler in '74, and while one body was recovered, the others were never found. Locals called it cursed. "That river keeps what it wants," one elderly resident muttered, watching deputies drag the current for a 3rd time. But there were other rumors, too. A delivery driver from a different company claimed he saw a dark blue sedan parked near the southern approach to the bridge the night Mark disappeared. He didn't see who was inside, just faint brake lights glowing through the fog. Police logged the statement but couldn't trace the vehicle. Online message boards lit up, too, drawing amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists from beyond the county. Some claimed Mark had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see: illegal dumping, drug trafficking, or something even more dangerous. One anonymous user claimed to have proof Mark was still alive and hiding. The post vanished within hours, deleted by its author. The louder the theories grew, the quieter the sheriff's office became. Official statements stopped coming. There was nothing new to report. But inside the Dalton family home, the silence was unbearable. For Angela Dalton, the days after Mark's disappearance blurred into one long, sleepless night. She sat at the kitchen table, a spiral notebook open in front of her, replaying every detail of their last phone call. The one she didn't know would be the last. He'd called her around noon that day, asking about their old dog, Lucy, and reminding her to take the truck in for an oil change. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. He wouldn't just leave, Angela told reporters through tears. He didn't even sound upset. None of this makes sense. By the 2nd week, Angela had organized her own search parties, printing missing person flyers and knocking on doors across Bridgewater County. She refused to believe the official narrative that Mark had simply vanished, convinced someone knew more than they were saying. Her voice cracked during every interview, but her resolve only hardened. Somebody out there knows something. It was around this time that Mark's younger brother, David Dalton, stepped into the spotlight. Unlike Angela, David wasn't interested in press conferences or polite appeals. He became consumed by the case, combing through Mark's delivery manifests, retracing his roots, and visiting every stop his brother had made that day. Where deputies saw dead ends, David saw patterns. He scoured old maps of Devil's Bend, convinced there were trails and river access points investigators had overlooked. Friends tried to intervene when his obsession grew. David quit his job at a local hardware store and poured every dollar of his savings into equipment: radios, waterproof boots, camping gear, a handheld GPS unit. He spent nights parked along Devil's Bend, watching the river in silence, hoping the current might reveal its secrets. Tension within the family deepened. Angela accused David of chasing ghosts, while she focused on keeping Mark's name in the headlines. David accused Angela of trusting the sheriff's office too much. "They've already given up," he snapped during one heated argument, "but I won't." By the end of the first month, the Daltons had gone from united in grief to fractured by obsession. Mark's absence wasn't just a mystery anymore, it was eroding the family piece by piece. And somewhere beneath the roar of the Willamette River, Devil's Bend kept its secrets. 2 years after Mark Dalton vanished, the case had gone cold. Leads had dried up, search efforts had stopped, and the Dalton family was left clinging to fading hope. Then, in the summer of 1994, something surfaced, a discovery that reignited the investigation and split investigators straight down the middle. It began when a property developer purchased an old, shuttered roadside motel along Highway 17, roughly 30 miles east of Bridgewater. The place had been abandoned for years, ivy swallowing its walls and weeds clawing up through the cracked asphalt. Inside one of the corner units, workers found something strange. A suitcase wedged beneath the sagging bed frame. Inside were several neatly folded shirts, a pair of scuffed work boots, and a worn baseball cap. To anyone else, it might have seemed unremarkable, but to Angela Dalton, one item was unmistakable. A Northwest Provisions uniform shirt with Mark's embroidered name patch. The shirt appeared identical to those issued to company drivers in 1992, right down to the frayed stitching along the hem. Forensic investigators bagged the clothing, along with a few personal items found in the same suitcase. A comb, a lighter, and a folded map of Bridgewater County marked with faint pencil lines along several rural back roads. DNA testing was performed, but the results came back inconclusive. There was no blood, no fingerprints, no definitive proof the items belonged to Mark at all. Even the motel records were useless. The owner had died in 1993, and all guest logs were missing. Still, some investigators believed the find was significant, a breadcrumb leading them closer to the truth. Others weren't so sure. Without a receipt, signature, or timeline, the suitcase could have been planted to mislead them, and the marked map raised even more questions. Who drew those lines? Why highlight roads leading toward Devil's Bend Bridge instead of away from it? David Dalton drove to the site himself the day he heard the news. He walked the cracked floors, touched the peeling wallpaper, and stared at the dusty window overlooking the parking lot. "He was here," he whispered. "I know it." But no one could prove it, and without answers, the motel discovery became another thread in a growing web of speculation, one more clue that led nowhere. By 1997, 5 years had passed since Mark Dalton disappeared, and Angela had settled into an uneasy rhythm. She worked, raised their daughter, and searched when she could. Then one evening, just past midnight, the phone rang. Angela answered groggily, expecting a wrong number. Instead, she heard only static at first, low, hissing interference like wind against a microphone. Then, faintly, a man's voice cut through, distorted and distant. "Stop looking." The line went dead. Angela sat frozen, staring at the receiver in her hand, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely breathe. She called David immediately, who arrived minutes later, demanding she replay the answering machine tape. But when she pressed play, there was nothing, no recording, no evidence the call had ever happened. Bridgewater deputies traced the incoming number to a payphone near Devil's Bend Bridge, less than a mile from where Mark's GPS pinged on the night he vanished. Security cameras weren't common in rural Bridgewater at the time, and by the time investigators arrived, the storm that week had wiped away any possible footprints or tire marks near the site. David was convinced it was Mark. He argued that his brother had escaped something that night, that he was alive, but too afraid to come home. Angela wasn't so sure. She swore the voice sounded wrong, raspy, strained, older somehow. When she played the sound over in her head, she couldn't decide if it carried fear or menace. The sheriff's office dismissed the call as a cruel prank, likely orchestrated by someone following the case. But privately, a few investigators weren't so quick to write it off. They noted the timing, the location, and the chilling familiarity of the voice. David grew restless after that night. He began spending hours parked near the payphone, watching passing cars, logging license plates in a notebook filled with theories, timelines, and maps. He was sure the caller would come back. He never did. For Angela, the call shattered what little stability she'd built since 1992. It meant one of two things. Someone knew the truth about what happened to Mark, or someone was willing to scare her into stopping before she found out. Either possibility was terrifying. By the spring of 1998, 6 years had passed since Mark Dalton disappeared, but locals still spoke about Devil's Bend Bridge in hushed tones. Stories circulated in bars, diners, and backroad gas stations, strange currents, eerie noises beneath the span, and sightings of shadows twisting in the depths where the Willamette River narrowed into a violent choke point. Most shrugged them off as folklore. But then a few local divers came forward with something chilling. During a weekend recreational dive, a team from the Bridgewater Aquatic Club reported seeing what they described as a rectangular silhouette, box-shaped, resting against the jagged riverbed roughly 40 feet below the bridge. One diver, Rick Mason, later recalled how his flashlight beam caught the faint glint of metal beneath layers of silt. It was big, he said, like a truck or a van, just sitting there, wedged in deep. News of the sighting traveled fast, forcing the sheriff's office to authorize an official search. On May 14th, a professional dive team entered the water, but conditions proved nearly impossible. Weeks of relentless rain had transformed the Willamette into a boiling torrent, its currents surging like a living thing. Visibility dropped to less than a foot, the riverbed cloaked in darkness and debris. Divers resurfaced after just 20 minutes, their helmets scratched, their oxygen tanks scraped from colliding with unseen rocks. One diver swore he felt something metallic beneath him, but couldn't confirm its shape before being yanked downstream by the current. They tried again the next day. Same result. The river fought back, swallowing divers in clouds of silt until they could barely see their own gloves in front of their faces. After 3 failed attempts, the search was suspended. For locals, the rumors only grew. Some claimed the divers had seen more than they admitted, that the sheriff's office was covering up evidence of Mark's truck beneath the waterline. Others insisted it wasn't Mark's truck at all, but another vehicle entirely, tied to things Bridgewater doesn't want talked about. David Dalton latched onto every word. He walked the riverbanks at night, staring into the black water, convinced Mark was down there. But without proof, the theory remained just that, a rumor drowned by the roar of the river. By early 1999, the case took an unexpected turn. Bridgewater deputies had long treated Mark Dalton's disappearance as a local mystery, an accident, maybe foul play, but nothing more. Then the FBI showed up. It began with an unrelated investigation into interstate trafficking along the I-5 corridor. Federal agents had been tracking a ring suspected of moving stolen goods and illicit chemicals across Oregon and Washington. During a warehouse raid outside Salem, agents seized documents linking several small distribution companies, including Northwest Provisions, Mark's employer, to unusual shipping patterns in the early 1990s. Among the names highlighted on those manifests, Mark Dalton. The files suggested Mark's delivery routes had occasionally overlapped with unlogged cargo transfers, shipments not listed on any official manifest, routed through backroads near Devil's Bend Bridge. On paper, it looked like Mark might have stumbled into something bigger than anyone realized. By March, FBI agents were in Bridgewater, quietly requesting access to case files and interviewing former company employees. One unnamed agent told deputies off record that if Dalton saw something he shouldn't have, this wasn't just about a missing driver anymore. Angela was blindsided when federal investigators arrived at her door. They asked about Mark's routines, his friends, and whether he'd ever mentioned seeing something strange along his routes. Angela said no, but later admitted to David that she remembered one night in late 1991 when Mark came home shaken, unusually quiet, refusing to explain why. She'd never pressed him about it, until now. When David learned the FBI's theory, his obsession deepened. He became convinced Mark had witnessed something criminal that night, possibly tied to toxic dumping or illegal cargo hidden beneath legitimate deliveries. But if that were true, why hadn't anyone come forward in 7 years? And why did it all lead back to Devil's Bend? The FBI's involvement gave the case new life, but it also raised unsettling questions. If federal agents were right, Mark Dalton hadn't simply vanished into a storm. Someone had wanted him gone. For the first time since 1992, the possibility of intentional disappearance became harder to ignore. By 2001, nearly a decade after Mark Dalton's disappearance, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. There were no new sightings, no new tips, and the FBI had quietly stepped back after their trafficking probe collapsed without arrests. For Angela, life had been frozen since that April night in 1992, but everyone around her seemed to be moving on. Eventually, she tried to do the same. That spring, she remarried, a quiet ceremony in a small church outside Bridgewater. Her new husband, Michael Jennings, was a kind, soft-spoken mechanic who understood, better than anyone, that Mark's absence wasn't something Angela could simply put behind her. He never asked her to replace the photos of Mark still sitting on the mantel, or take off her old wedding ring, which she now kept in a jewelry box by her bed. In interviews years later, Angela would describe those early years of her second marriage as gentle but hollow. She laughed again, found some measure of stability, but the wound never fully closed. "Every time I hear a truck engine," she admitted once, "I look up. Every time I see white headlights on a rainy road, I wonder if maybe it's him." David, meanwhile, had gone the other way entirely. While Angela sought healing, David dove deeper into obsession. He quit his job at a hardware store and lived off his savings, dedicating every waking hour to unraveling his brother's disappearance. His small apartment slowly transformed into a command center. Stacks of maps lining the walls, newspaper clippings pinned over timelines, hundreds of pages of handwritten notes detailing witness statements, traffic reports, and weather patterns from April 17, 1992. Friends stopped calling. His landlord complained about all-night activity when David built an improvised police scanner set up to monitor emergency channels. "They gave up on Mark," David said bitterly of law enforcement. "I didn't." Angela worried about him, but she'd learned not to argue. David lived inside that case, she later said. Even when he wasn't talking about it, you could see it in his eyes. He wasn't really here anymore. Bridgewater had all but forgotten Mark Dalton by then, but David hadn't. And in 2003, a single piece of evidence would pull him, and the case, back into the storm. It began in an old filing cabinet no one had opened in years. In July 2003, while digging through records at the now-defunct Northwest Provisions headquarters, David stumbled onto something investigators had missed. A dusty, water-stained company ledger dated April 1992. Inside, handwritten manifests listed every delivery made the day Mark disappeared. David compared them to copies of the documents provided to police back in '92. At first, they matched perfectly. Same stops, same times, same totals. Until he noticed one line buried halfway down the page. Route 17, B, stop 6. Special delivery. There was no signature, no address, no invoice number. Just a note in the margin. Drop confirmed. David checked the official police files. Nothing. This extra delivery didn't exist anywhere else. Not in Mark's original manifest, not in the sheriff's reports, not in the FBI's files. According to every official record, Mark should have headed back to the depot after his stop at the Pine Grove Diner. Instead, the company's own ledger suggested He made one more delivery. To someone. Somewhere. The coordinates scribbled next to the entry weren't for a business. They pointed to an unmarked back road near Devil's Bend Bridge. David brought the ledger to the sheriff's office immediately, expecting urgency. Instead, he was met with silence and polite deflection. They logged the evidence but didn't reopen the case. The FBI looked at everything, Sheriff Lasker said flatly. If this was relevant, they'd have flagged it. David didn't believe him. He began cross-referencing company logs, finding 3 other unexplained special deliveries assigned to different drivers, all routed near the bend, all within 6 months of Mark's disappearance. Late one night, poring over maps by the glow of a single desk lamp, David whispered aloud what he'd been afraid to admit for years. Mark didn't disappear, someone made him. For David, the ledger wasn't just a clue, it was confirmation. The company had hidden something, and he was going to find out what. By 2005, 13 years after Mark Dalton vanished, the Bridgewater Sheriff's Office officially declared the investigation a cold case. No new leads had surfaced in over a decade, and the FBI had long since withdrawn. At a quiet press conference, Sheriff Paul Lasker stood in front of a handful of reporters and read from a prepared statement. After extensive investigation, including coordination with federal authorities, we have exhausted all viable leads regarding the disappearance of Mark Dalton. At this time, the case will be classified inactive pending new information. There were no follow-up questions. There was nothing left to ask. For Angela, it felt like a death sentence without a body. She refused to sign any declaration presuming Mark legally dead, clinging to a shred of hope that someday he might walk back through her door. David, meanwhile, saw the announcement as confirmation of what he'd always suspected. Law enforcement had given up on his brother long ago. Inactive doesn't mean solved, he said bitterly. It just means they stopped looking. With the case buried in boxes and shelved in the county archives, Mark Dalton slowly transformed from a man into a story. Around Bridgewater, his name became shorthand for unsolved tragedy, the delivery driver who vanished into the river. Locals swapped exaggerated versions over campfires and bar counters, each retelling darker than the last. Some swore his truck was buried under tons of silt beneath Devil's Bend Bridge, trapped forever in the river's undertow. Others whispered about strange lights seen above the water that night, or a phantom trucker still driving Route 17 long after his death. By then, even the Pine Grove diner where Mark was last seen had capitalized on the lore. A framed clipping from the original newspaper article hung above the cash register, alongside a handwritten sign, "Ask about the Dalton Special." Tourists came through on weekends, eager to hear Evelyn Harris, the last known person to see Mark alive, retell her story for the 1,000th time. For most of Bridgewater, the mystery had become entertainment. But for David, it remained an open wound. He wasn't ready to let it die. And in 2010, 5 years after the cold case declaration, someone would give him a reason to keep digging. In the summer of 2010, David received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Harold Whitman, a retired Bridgewater Sheriff's deputy who had worked the Dalton case back in 1992. Now, in his late 60s, Whitman's voice trembled as he spoke. "There were things about that bridge," he said, "we weren't supposed to talk about." David drove to meet him at a small cafe off Highway 6. Whitman sat in a corner booth, shoulders hunched, his coffee untouched. After a long silence, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "We were told to stop looking downstream that night. Orders from above. There were reports about dumping." David pressed him for details, and slowly, Whitman began to unravel fragments of a story buried for nearly 2 decades. According to Whitman, multiple deputies had suspected that illegal chemical dumping had been happening in and around the Willamette River during the late 80s and early 90s. Certain companies, Whitman didn't name them directly, were allegedly paying off local officials to ignore environmental violations. Then came the chilling part. Whitman claimed some of the original search reports from the Dalton case had been altered or destroyed. Dive logs disappeared. Photographs of tire impressions near the southern approach to Devil's Bend were misfiled. He remembered overhearing his superior telling another deputy, "Don't dig too deep on Dalton. It's not our problem." David asked if Whitman believed Mark had seen something tied to the dumping operations that night, something he shouldn't have. Whitman hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "If your brother went missing down there," he said, "it wasn't by accident." David left the cafe shaking, clutching his notebook so hard the spiral bent out of shape. Whitman wouldn't go on record, terrified of lawsuits and old debts that never got settled. But it didn't matter. To David, this was the first real lead in years. It meant the river might not just hold Mark's secrets, it might hold someone else's too. By early 2011, David Dalton had reached his breaking point. Nearly 20 years had passed since Mark's disappearance, and the Bridgewater Sheriff's Office refused to reopen the case, despite Deputy Whitman's confession about missing evidence. "If the police won't look," David told Angela, "then I'll do it myself." She begged him to let it go, to stop sinking his life into a ghost. But David was beyond persuasion. That spring, David cashed out what little was left of his savings and hired a team of independent specialists. Among them was Sarah Lynn, a respected forensic diver known for recovering evidence in cold cases others had long abandoned. Sarah had spent 12 years working with search and recovery teams up and down the Pacific Northwest. Her reputation was built on an ability to find what everyone else had missed. "If your brother's truck is down there," she told David during their first meeting, "we'll find it." The plan was simple on paper: conduct sonar mapping along the deepest sections beneath Devil's Bend Bridge and dive any anomalies. But anyone who knew the Willamette River understood the danger. The current beneath the bend was unpredictable and violent, a swirling undertow strong enough to drag entire trees under in seconds. "This isn't recreational diving," Sarah warned the team during the briefing. "Visibility's going to be close to zero. One wrong move down there, and the river keeps you." David insisted on being present at every stage of the search, though Sarah forbade him from entering the water himself. "You hired me to bring you answers," she said firmly. "Let me do the dangerous part." By late autumn, the team conducted preliminary sonar sweeps from a small aluminum boat anchored near the bridge. The first passes came back empty, nothing but jagged rocks and endless silt, but Sarah refused to be discouraged. "If there's a vehicle down there," she explained, studying the scans, "it's probably buried. We'll need full 3D imaging." David's gamble wasn't cheap. Every hour on the river cost hundreds of dollars in equipment, specialists, and permits. But he didn't care. "If I go broke finding Mark," he told Angela, "then at least I'll finally know." By early 2012, after months of failed scans and mounting tension, the team would finally see something on sonar they couldn't explain, something man-made, massive, and resting 40 feet below the Blackwater. On April 14, 2012, under a cold gray sky, the divers prepared to descend. The sonar scans from the previous day had revealed a solid object directly beneath the central span of Devil's Bend Bridge, 40 feet down, wedged into the riverbed at an unnatural angle. Sarah Lynn knelt on the deck of the boat, fitting her helmet and double-checking her oxygen lines. The rest of the dive team, 2 seasoned recovery specialists from Portland, moved in silence, their faces pale and tight. Everyone understood the risks. The Willamette was swollen from early spring runoff, its current vicious and unpredictable. Visibility was estimated at less than 18 inches. At 10:32 a.m., Sarah slipped beneath the surface. Instantly, she was swallowed by darkness. The water here was colder than expected, a bone-deep chill that cut through her dry suit. Her headlamp illuminated only fragments, bits of broken branches, clouds of disturbed silt, and smooth river stones glowing faintly before disappearing into black. 2 minutes down, Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. "Visibility's nearly zero. Feels like flying blind." At 20 feet, the current slammed against her shoulder, forcing her to anchor herself against a protruding rock. The pressure was suffocating, the silence absolute except for her steady breaths and the muted roar of the river above. Then, at 38 feet, her headlamp caught a glimmer. "Contact," she whispered. Her glove brushed against cold steel beneath a thick layer of silt. She fanned the sediment away and froze. A flat panel. Faded white paint beneath algae growth. Sarah traced her hand along the contour and felt a seam, then another. "It's a vehicle," she said softly into the radio. "Big one, box-shaped." From the deck above, David's voice came through faintly. "Is it his truck?" "Can't confirm yet," Sarah replied. "But whatever this is, it's been down here a long time." She marked the location with a tether line and began taking photographs, though most came back as indistinct shadows. Then her helmet camera panned upward, capturing something unexpected. One of the truck's rear doors, slightly ajar, swaying gently in the current. Inside, total darkness. Sarah hesitated, knowing the risks. "Prepping interior entry," she said, her voice tight. "Negative," one of the topside divers interrupted sharply. "Current's too unstable. Abort for today." Reluctantly, Sarah surfaced, her suit dripping and helmet scratched. But she carried with her the first real proof in 20 years. Something man-made was trapped beneath Devil's Bend, and soon they'd go back down. On April 21st, 2012, 1 week after Sarah Lynn's first dive, the recovery team returned to Devil's Bend Bridge with additional equipment, heavier anchors, high-powered floodlights, and a portable winch system capable of handling several tons of submerged debris. The sonar scans were unmistakable now. The object resting 40 feet below the river's surface had flat, even panels, sharp edges, and a profile too symmetrical to be natural. David Dalton stood on the deck, rainwater dripping from his hood, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. At 9:15 a.m., Sarah and the team descended again. Within minutes, her gloved hands brushed across the silt-covered surface they'd located the week prior. Using a scrub brush, she cleared a patch of algae and mud, revealing chipped white paint beneath. And then letters. "Northwest Provisions," she whispered over comms. David staggered back when he heard it. For 20 years, those words had haunted him, printed across hundreds of missing person flyers and old delivery manifests. Now they were real, glimmering beneath the shifting light of Sarah's headlamp. They worked slowly, methodically, documenting every inch of the discovery. The truck lay upside down, its roof crushed against jagged river rocks, partially buried beneath decades of sediment. Thick vines and tree branches had tangled themselves around the frame, holding it fast like skeletal hands. One rear door was slightly ajar, but the other was locked tight, sealed shut by time and pressure. At 10:42 a.m., Sarah swam to the back of the vehicle and cleared debris from the bumper. Moments later, her voice broke through the static-filled comms. "Confirmed," she said. "License plate reads 4M7621. It was Mark's truck. David collapsed onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. For the first time since 1992, there was no debate, no theory, no rumor. They had found it. But as Sarah circled the cab, something unexpected unsettled her. All 4 windows were intact, no signs of shattering or forced entry. And when she checked the driver's side door, the handle resisted, locked from the inside. "If the cab's sealed," she said softly, her voice tight, "then where's Mark?" That single question shifted the tone of the entire recovery operation. 2 days later, on April 23rd, divers returned to breach the truck's cab and document its contents. The river was calmer now, the current slackened by a brief window of fair weather, but visibility remained near zero. Sarah led the team once more, carrying a pry bar and waterproof camera rig. At 11:12 a.m., she forced open the driver's side door. A cloud of silt exploded outward, swirling like smoke in the dark water, and for a moment the interior was invisible. Slowly the shadows cleared, and the cab emerged, frozen in time. Boxes still strapped in place behind the seats, crumpled receipts in the door pocket, a pair of sunglasses resting neatly on the dashboard. Nothing disturbed, nothing stolen. But no sign of Mark. Sarah's light swept across the steering column and landed on something small, delicate, and chilling. A silver wristwatch, caught between the seat and the console. She brushed away a thin layer of sediment and read the dial. 6:19 p.m. The hands had stopped there, frozen at the precise moment when Mark's GPS last pinged 20 years earlier. Her breath caught in her headset. "David," she said quietly, "you need to hear this." His watch stopped at 6:19. David stood on deck, gripping the radio so hard his fingers went numb. He didn't answer at first, just stared across the black water below the bridge, hearing his own pulse roaring in his ears. Then Sarah's voice returned, lower, shaken. Seatbelts unbuckled. The driver's restraint dangled loose, floating slightly in the current, but there was no body in the seat, no skeletal remains tangled in the wreckage. It was as though Mark had simply unlatched himself, opened the cab, and vanished. Forensics later confirmed there was no blood in the cab, no broken glass, no damage to the interior at all. Everything about the truck suggested a sudden, deliberate exit, but no one could explain why. Sarah surfaced 30 minutes later, peeling off her helmet, her face pale beneath dripping curls of black hair. "I've seen recoveries where bodies get swept away," she said almost to herself, "but not like this, not with locked doors, not after 20 years. For David, the truck's discovery was no longer closure. It was an open wound, deeper than ever. Mark Dalton had been inside that cab, but he hadn't drowned there. The day after divers breached the cab, the recovery team hauled Mark Dalton's truck out of the water. A rented crane, anchored on the southern bank of Devil's Bend Bridge, groaned under the weight as the mud-soaked delivery vehicle finally emerged after 20 years of silence. Water poured from the crushed frame, mixing with dark river silt, filling the air with a damp, metallic smell. David stood just beyond the safety perimeter, his jaw clenched as though bracing for impact. Forensic techs immediately began cataloging the truck's contents. Inside the cargo area, most of Mark's deliveries remained exactly where they'd been secured back in April of 1992, boxes warped from decades underwater, but still tightly strapped in place. There were frozen goods, non-perishables, and beverage crates, all labeled with faded company stickers. But then came the discrepancy. According to Mark's original manifest, there should have been 12 crates on board. Only 11 were recovered. At first, investigators assumed one had broken loose and been swept away by the current. But when they cross-referenced the missing crate against the company records, they froze. The absent shipment matched the handwritten entry David had uncovered years earlier in the missing company ledger, the mysterious unassigned delivery, marked Route 17B, Stop 6, Special Drop. The FBI reviewed the find quietly, off the record, but declined to release details to the public. David, however, was given the invoice number and began digging into the destination listed on the surviving paperwork. There was no customer name, no business address, just a set of coordinates pointing to an unmarked road south of Devil's Bend. "Someone signed off on this crate," David said, holding up the sodden documents under the glow of his desk lamp that night. "Someone expected it, and it's the only thing missing." Angela refused to read the report. For her, the discovery only confirmed what she had feared for years. Mark's disappearance wasn't an accident. Someone had sent him into danger that night. The crate's contents were never identified. Its absence became the center of every new theory, evidence of something criminal, something big enough to make Mark Dalton vanish without a trace. And what the forensic team found next inside the cab would only deepen the mystery. The forensic analysis on Mark Dalton's truck began 3 days after its recovery, conducted in a sealed bay under tight security. Every inch of the cab was photographed, every fiber swabbed, every surface scanned for latent prints. It didn't take long for the first shock to surface. On the passenger seat, beneath 2 decades of compacted silt, Investigators detected trace amounts of dried human blood. The sample was small, less than a teaspoon, but distinct enough for DNA extraction. And it wasn't Mark's. David was sitting in a borrowed conference room at the sheriff's office when Sarah Lynn came in holding the preliminary report. She didn't speak at first, just slid the folder across the table. David flipped it open, his finger tracing the highlighted sentence. DNA profile, unknown adult male. His stomach dropped. The FBI ordered an expedited run through CODIS, the National DNA Database. 3 weeks later, the results came back. No matches. Whoever sat in that passenger seat had no recorded identity, at least not in any criminal, federal, or medical database available. Even stranger, there were no corresponding fingerprints. The cab yielded multiple smudged partials, but none were clear enough to identify. No wallet, no ID, no personal effects belonging to anyone other than Mark. Whoever bled there had seemingly vanished from existence afterward, leaving only a few microscopic clues behind. The sheriff's office kept this information from the public, fearing it would trigger wild speculation, but rumors began leaking almost immediately. Locals whispered about the missing crate, the hidden ledger, and now, the blood. Some believed Mark had picked up a passenger that night, someone tied to whatever special delivery he'd been assigned. Others whispered a darker possibility: Mark wasn't the target at all. Sarah, reviewing the recovered data, shook her head. "This wasn't random," she told David quietly. 2 men sat in that truck. One of them bled. Neither of them made it home. For David, it was confirmation of what he'd feared since the beginning. Mark had stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see, something big enough to erase people completely. But if the blood belonged to someone else, where was Mark Dalton? On May 3, 2012, while the recovered truck sat in a secure forensics bay, Sarah Lynn returned to Devil's Bend Bridge with 2 members of her dive team. She wasn't satisfied with leaving anything behind. The discovery of the missing crate and the unidentified blood gnawed at her, and she believed the riverbed still held answers. That morning, beneath a weak spring sun, she suited up and slipped back into the black water. Her goal was to conduct a final sweep beneath where the truck had been wedged, hoping to locate debris the crane might have missed. Within minutes of reaching the riverbed, her hand brushed against something unexpected, a sharp metallic edge hidden beneath tangled roots and a slab of rock. She fanned away the silt, revealing a small, sealed lockbox, roughly the size of a shoebox, jammed against the truck's undercarriage where it had likely been lodged for 20 years. "Marking something," she whispered into comms, her voice steady but tight. "Small container, secured under the frame." Back on the boat, the team carefully extracted the box and sealed it in an evidence bag before transporting it to the forensic lab. David arrived within the hour, hovering near the technicians as they prepared to cut it open under controlled conditions. Inside were 3 items. The first, a stack of Polaroid photographs, water-damaged but partially preserved. Most were blurred, dark shots of back roads and river crossings, but one, disturbingly clear, showed the silhouette of a white box truck parked beneath Devil's Bend Bridge at night. The second, a folded packet of hand-drawn maps on yellowed notebook paper, marked with red ink. Each map traced obscure backroads and river access trails, all circling one location, the stretch of river beneath the bridge. The third, and most unsettling, was a torn delivery receipt dated April 17, 1992. Though warped by water, one signature was legible: Mark Dalton. David stared at the receipt for several minutes, his throat tight, his hands trembling. "He signed this," he whispered, "but not for anything on his manifest." Sarah said nothing, just stared at the Polaroids, her brow furrowed. Someone had been documenting Mark's route that day, and someone had wanted these maps hidden where no one would ever find them. By late June 2012, federal investigators quietly reopened the Dalton case, driven by what Sarah's lockbox revealed: The maps, Polaroids, and missing crate suggested Mark's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. Digging deeper, analysts uncovered something far more unsettling, a pattern stretching back decades. Between 1985 and 1994, 3 other delivery drivers vanished under eerily similar circumstances. July 14, 1985, Earl Simmons, 41, disappeared while hauling dry goods from Portland to Ashland. His last known GPS ping? Less than 2 miles from Devil's Bend Bridge. September 2, 1989, Victor Ramirez, 29, failed to complete a route between Salem and Eugene. His truck was later recovered abandoned along a logging road. Empty cargo bay, missing manifest, no sign of foul play. November 19, 1994, Gordon Gordy Flannery, 37, disappeared on a night shift run. He was never found. In each case, routes passed directly through Bridgewater County, overlapping a cluster of isolated backroads connected to Devil's Bend. The FBI assembled a task force to cross-reference missing persons reports, company logs, and shipment records from that era. What emerged was chilling. All 4 drivers, including Mark, were assigned special deliveries, unlogged stops recorded only in internal ledgers, never reported to local authorities or insurance carriers. And in every case, 1 crate was unaccounted for. David sat across from federal investigators as they presented their findings, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. So this wasn't random, this was organized. One agent nodded grimly. If these disappearances are connected, he said, then Mark didn't just stumble into something, he was part of something much bigger. Locals reacted with a mix of fascination and dread. For years, Devil's Bend had been a backdrop for ghost stories, a cursed landmark whispered about over campfires. Now, whispers turned into accusations. People asked why reports had been buried, why company logs were missing, and why so many of these cases shared the same coordinates. Angela broke down during a rare interview, her voice cracking. If they knew drivers were going missing out there, why didn't anyone warn him? But the questions didn't stop there. Because when analysts studied Sarah's recovered maps more closely, they noticed something the initial sweep had missed: handwritten markings along the riverbank suggesting multiple access tunnels beneath Devil's Bend. And those tunnels weren't on any official record. By August 2012, investigators focused on one detail from Sarah's recovered maps: a faint red circle drawn around an abandoned trucking depot 30 miles north of Bridgewater. The location matched a property once owned by Cascade Freight Solutions, a company dissolved in 1996 after a series of quiet lawsuits alleging illegal chemical dumping into waterways along the Willamette River. David and Sarah drove out together to see it for themselves. The depot sat at the end of a cracked access road, its rusted gates chained shut and warning signs flapping weakly in the wind. Hazardous site, keep out. The windows were smashed, the corrugated walls overgrown with ivy, but the outline of its operations was still visible. Loading bays, fuel pumps, and half-buried drums of chemical waste leaking faint streaks of blue into the soil. Inside, scattered papers lay across the floor, half-rotted from years of damp. Among them, Sarah found a logbook fragment dated April 1992, matching the week Mark disappeared. The pages referenced unlogged deliveries routed through Bridgewater County, including coded entries that matched the coordinates from the missing ledger David had discovered years earlier. More disturbing were the statements from former employees tracked down by federal investigators. One ex-driver, speaking under anonymity, claimed he had been paid cash for nighttime drops during the late 80s and early 90s. The shipments were unmanifested, usually marked with nothing but a handwritten tag reading "Special." "We didn't ask what was in the crates," the man admitted. "We didn't want to know, but we knew where not to ask questions. Devil's Bend, always Devil's Bend." Another former supervisor confessed that multiple drivers had refused certain routes, citing strange instructions and drop points that didn't make sense. Some were reassigned. Others quit. David brought this information to the sheriff's office, but officials brushed it off, calling the connections speculative. He knew better. Mark's truck, the missing crate, the blood, the maps, it all tied back here to a depot that had vanished quietly from public record. Sarah studied the documents late that night, tracing lines between names and dates until a chilling realization set in. Someone had orchestrated these deliveries for years, using legitimate routes to move illegitimate cargo. Mark hadn't just vanished into a river. He'd been caught in the machinery of something much larger, something designed to stay hidden. Angela Dalton had refused to look at the Polaroid Sarah recovered from the lockbox for weeks. She'd buried herself in routine, clinging to the fragile life she had rebuilt since remarrying. But in September 2012, David showed up unannounced, the photos spread out across her kitchen table, like evidence at a crime scene. "You need to see this," he said softly. Angela hesitated, her hands trembling as she picked up the top photograph. Most of the images were dark and blurred, grainy shots of back roads, unlit trailheads, and the underbelly of Devil's Bend Bridge. But the third Polaroid stopped her cold. It showed a man leaning casually against a white delivery truck, Mark's truck, his head turned slightly, smiling at the camera. Despite the low light and grainy quality, Angela recognized his posture instantly, the slight tilt of his shoulders, the way his hands tucked into his pockets. The timestamp scrawled in red ink along the bottom corner read, April 17, 1992, 5:32 p.m., exactly 1 hour after Mark's last confirmed sighting at the Pine Grove Diner. Angela's breath caught, her vision blurred. She whispered his name once, softly, before collapsing onto the tile floor. David rushed to catch her, the Polaroid still clutched tightly in her fist. When she regained consciousness minutes later, she sat silently in the kitchen chair, staring at the photograph. "He was alive," she said, her voice breaking. "He was alive after the diner." For David, the timestamp was proof that Mark had made at least one additional stop that day, one never documented, one tied to the missing crate. But for Angela, the photo was unbearable. It was hope tangled with grief, a ghost preserved on fading film. Later that night, Angela confided in Sarah that she'd been having recurring dreams since Mark vanished, dreams of headlights on dark roads, of voices calling her name from beneath the water. "I thought they were just nightmares," she whispered, holding the photo close. "But now I don't know anymore." The image raised more questions than answers. Who took the photograph? Why document it? And why hide it beneath Mark's truck for 20 years? For Angela, the discovery tore open an old wound she'd spent years trying to heal. For David, it confirmed one terrifying truth. Mark Dalton hadn't disappeared by accident. On October 6, 2012, Sarah Lynn led her dive team back beneath Devil's Bend Bridge for what she called a final clearance sweep. Officially, the purpose was to recover any overlooked debris from Mark Dalton's truck before winter rains made diving impossible. Unofficially, Sarah wasn't convinced the river had given up all of its secrets. Visibility that morning was better than usual, about 3 feet, but the current remained unpredictable, swirling in tight, erratic patterns near the collapsed southern embankment. Sarah focused her search around the spot where Mark's delivery truck had been wedged, scraping away compacted silt beneath the chassis when her gloved hand snagged on something jagged. At first, she thought it was just rock, but when she cleared away more sediment, the truth surfaced. A fragment of human bone, small but unmistakable, lodged between the truck's crushed front grille and a bent section of steel framing. "Tagging something," Sarah said softly into her comms. Her voice was flat, restrained. Further inspection revealed 2 additional fragments, wedged deep beneath rusted metal plating, pieces too large to belong to a single individual. Sarah carefully placed them in sealed containers and surfaced immediately, her face pale beneath her dripping helmet. Back at the forensic lab, analysts confirmed what Sarah suspected. The fragments were human remains, but when compared against Mark Dalton's dental and DNA records, the results stunned everyone. Not Mark's. The preliminary analysis revealed at least 2 separate DNA profiles, both belonging to unidentified adult males. Neither profile matched the blood sample found on the passenger seat, meaning there were now 3 unknown individuals potentially connected to Mark's disappearance. David's hands trembled as he held the report. 3 people, he muttered. 3 different people in my brother's truck, or near it. The revelation triggered a wave of new theories. Were the remains connected to the missing crate? To Cascade Freight's illegal nighttime drops? Or had Devil's Bend simply claimed more victims over the decades, its violent undertow catching anyone who wandered too close? For Sarah, there was no question. This isn't coincidence, she said, reviewing dive logs that same night. Someone used this river over and over again. The fragments were sent to the FBI's forensics unit for further testing, and with them, the case crossed a threshold it could never return from. On November 2, 2012, after 20 years of silence, the Bridgewater Sheriff's Office held its first major press conference on the Dalton case since declaring it cold in 2005. Reporters packed into a cramped municipal chamber, cameras flashing as Sheriff Paul Lasker stepped to the podium. He cleared his throat, unfolding a prepared statement. On April 21st, a vehicle registered to Mark Dalton was recovered from the Willamette River near Devil's Bend Bridge. At this time, no human remains believed to be Dalton's have been located. However, based on forensic analysis of evidence recovered at the scene, the Dalton case is officially reopened. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Does this mean you believe Mark Dalton is alive?" Lasker paused, his jaw tightening, before he replied, "We are treating this as an active missing persons investigation." Behind the scenes, the FBI assumed partial control, citing potential interstate criminal activity tied to the missing crate, the unknown DNA samples, and the historic pattern of similar disappearances. New subpoenas went out for Cascade Freight's surviving executives and environmental regulators, reopened investigations into alleged chemical dumping along the Willamette during the late 80s and early 90s. Local response was electric. Talk radio lit up, Bridgewater bars filled with speculation. Some residents were convinced Mark had been murdered over the unlogged delivery. Others whispered that he'd gone into hiding, aided by people who wanted to keep the crate's contents buried forever. For David, the announcement was bittersweet. Reopened meant resources, it meant leads, but it also meant reliving 20 years of unanswered questions. Angela, meanwhile, refused to attend the press conference. "I can't go through this again," she told Sarah. "I can't." Sarah herself became a central figure in the reopened investigation. Her diver's findings, especially the bone fragments and Polaroids, were now critical evidence. Federal agents requested every scan, every photo, every scrap of recovered data from Devil's Bend. And yet, beneath the flood of new activity, one haunting truth lingered. Mark's body was still missing. The truck had surfaced. The river had given up its secrets, but the man at the center of it all had simply disappeared. By early 2013, the reopening of Mark Dalton's case had consumed David entirely. The discovery of his brother's truck, the missing crate, the unidentified blood, the bone fragments, all of it pointed to one conclusion David refused to ignore. Mark hadn't drowned. He became convinced Mark had survived and gone into hiding, either forced into it or choosing it for his own safety. "If they killed him," David told Sarah one night, pacing his cluttered apartment, "we'd have found him. We'd have something. But we don't. That means he's alive." Angela begged him to stop, worried the investigation was swallowing him whole. But David couldn't rest. He started driving the isolated back roads around Devil's Bend Bridge, marking unpaved trails on his maps, exploring every locked gate and abandoned structure he could find. It was during one of these drives that he heard whispers about an off-grid community deep within the forests bordering the river, self-sustaining, isolated, and fiercely private. According to a local fisherman David interviewed, they've been out there since the early 90s, living off rainwater catch systems and solar panels, almost invisible to outsiders. David became obsessed. He started combing property records, satellite imagery, even old forestry permits, convinced Mark might be hiding among them, or being hidden by someone. Sarah warned him against going alone. "If these people are connected to the crate," she said, "you could be walking into something dangerous." But David wouldn't listen. In March, he parked his truck along an overgrown trailhead and hiked 6 miles into dense pine forest, following the faint outlines of what he believed to be old logging roads. He found remnants of campfires, discarded fuel drums, and, most hauntingly, a makeshift dock extending into a tributary that connected directly to Devil's Bend. At the end of the dock sat an old rope ladder, half submerged, slick with moss. Someone had been using the river. David returned shaken but energized, convinced more than ever that Mark had escaped whatever happened that night. But his fixation was starting to show. He stopped sleeping, stopped returning calls, his walls now plastered with overlapping maps, pinned timelines, and blurred copies of the Polaroids. Even Sarah began to worry. "You're chasing ghosts, David," she told him. He stared at her, unblinking. "Then I'll catch one?" In May 2013, the investigation broke wide open when Karen Holt, a former dispatcher for Cascade Freight Solutions, walked into the FBI field office in Portland, carrying a manila folder and a trembling cup of black coffee. She'd kept silent for over 20 years, but the discovery of Mark's truck had rattled something loose. "I need this off my conscience," she said during her first recorded interview. Holt explained that in the early 1990s, Cascade Freight was deeply involved in an illegal toxic dumping operation along several stretches of the Willamette River. According to her, company executives had been quietly routing hazardous waste through ordinary delivery trucks, including vehicles like Mark's, and disposing of the material near Devil's Bend Bridge under cover of night. "We all knew it was dangerous," she confessed. "But if you asked questions, you were replaced. Fast." She claimed Mark's route on April 17, 1992, included one of these unlogged special deliveries, the missing crate. Holt said Mark hadn't been informed of its contents, but later overheard him questioning his supervisor about inconsistencies in his manifests. "2 days before he disappeared," she said, "I heard Mark say, 'Something's wrong with this run.'" When asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, Holt hesitated, her hands shaking. "We were warned," she admitted. "Supervisors said the people backing these drops weren't just from the company. They had protection higher up." FBI agents corroborated parts of her testimony against surviving Cascade records. Multiple documents lined up perfectly with Holt's claims, including a coded ledger entry matching the missing crate's invoice. But the most chilling part of Holt's statement came last. She described a conversation she overheard the night after Mark vanished, between 2 supervisors closing the dispatch office. "He saw something," one said. "Then we don't have a problem anymore," the other replied. David sat silent as agents relayed her testimony. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, and whispered the words like a promise. "Then I'll find what he saw." By the winter of 2013, the Willamette had been searched more times than anyone could count. Sarah Lynn's dive team logged 17 separate descents beneath Devil's Bend Bridge, combing every crevice within a quarter-mile radius of where Mark Dalton's delivery truck had rested for 20 years. Specialized 3D sonar rigs were brought in, dredging teams scoured silt banks, and forensic divers sifted through debris one handful at a time. And yet, despite the exhaustive effort, Mark Dalton's body was never found. Each failed attempt fueled speculation around Bridgewater. Some locals insisted the river had swallowed him whole, dragging his remains into a network of unseen caverns beneath the bend. Old-timers swapped tales of shifting undertows and submerged tunnels carved by decades of flooding, places where, once trapped, nothing ever resurfaced. But the divers didn't buy it. Sarah, studying sonar overlays late into the night, found inconsistencies she couldn't explain. Deep voids beneath the riverbed where readings abruptly dropped into silence, as though the instruments couldn't penetrate them. "It's like the river has Layers, she told David one evening, her voice hushed, as though speaking it too loudly might conjure something best left undisturbed. Off the record, 2 recovery specialists admitted something stranger still. Multiple objects they'd marked for retrieval mysteriously shifted location between dives, despite 0 current changes on the surface. At least once, sonar picked up an unidentified metallic mass moving beneath their equipment, vanishing before they could lock onto it. Locals whispered about more than undertows. Some claimed the bend had been cursed long before Cascade Freight arrived, pointing to the long history of missing persons in the area, going back decades before Mark's disappearance. For David, the absence of Mark's remains only hardened his resolve. Bodies don't just vanish, he told Sarah, reviewing footage from the latest dive. Someone moved him, or someone's keeping him there. But winter rains were setting in, swelling the Willamette into a raging torrent. Further dives were suspended until spring. The official search stalled. David refused to stop. And then, in early 2014, something happened that shattered what little certainty anyone had left. On February 8, 2014, Angela Dalton came home to find her answering machine's light blinking. She pressed play absent-mindedly, expecting telemarketers or reminders from her doctor's office. Instead, she heard a man's whisper. "Stop looking," the voice rasped, faint but deliberate. "You'll end up where I am." Angela froze, the handset clattering to the floor. The call had come from an untraceable number, routed through 3 separate relays before terminating in Oregon. Panicked, Angela contacted David, who immediately brought the recording to federal investigators. The FBI sent the voicemail for forensic audio analysis, expecting a prank, a sick hoax exploiting the reopened case. 2 weeks later, the results returned. Preliminary voice match, 94.7% probability, Mark Dalton. Angela refused to believe it at first, replaying the clip over and over late into the night. "That's not him," she whispered to herself, rocking gently at the kitchen table. "That can't be him." David, meanwhile, clung to it like oxygen. To him, the voicemail was proof, not of Mark's death, but of his survival. "He's out there," David said. "He's alive, and he's trying to warn us." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She replayed the whisper through noise reduction software, isolating the faintest background sounds. Dripping water, muffled machinery, something metallic grinding in the distance. "It doesn't sound like he's free," she said quietly, turning to David. "It sounds like he's trapped." The voicemail remains the last confirmed development in the Dalton case. Federal agents refused to release the full clip publicly, citing ongoing investigative sensitivity. For Angela, it was the cruelest twist of all, a voice that sounded like her husband, alive after 20 years, pleading from somewhere she couldn't reach. For David, it was fuel. He doubled down, vowing to follow every remaining lead no matter where it took him. And for Sarah, staring at the sonar anomalies beneath Devil's Bend, one thought kept her awake at night. If Mark Dalton's still alive, then something else is down there with him. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.